Well, hello, everyone. Welcome, and thanks so much for joining us for this Anselm Exchange. My name is Andrew Hansen, and I'm the Program Director at Anselm House. If you are new to the Anselm House community, we are a Christian study center at the University of Minnesota, and our mission is to connect faith and knowledge with all of life. So we're a community of students, faculty, and staff at the University of Minnesota, as well as others from outside of the university who are interested in pursuing how the Christian faith relates to all fields of study and learning at the university. Today's exchange is part of a series that we're doing, series of reflections on the renewal of all things this Easter season. So we're exploring how the Easter message motivates Christians to pursue the renewal of all things in daily life and vocation. And today's exchange is on the topic of knowing and believing. So we're focusing especially on the renewal of the mind. So how does the Christian faith think about reason and knowing and this relationship between faith and knowledge? So this is obviously a huge topic. We can come at it from a wide number of angles. Obviously, there's countless thinkers throughout the Christian tradition that have considered this relationship between faith and knowledge. But we're coming at it today specifically through the thought of St Anselm of Canterbury. And Anselm was an 11th century monk and theologian. And if you've been paying any attention, he's obviously also the namesake for our Anselm House community. And what attracted us, I think in particular to Anselm as a namesake, was his idea of faith-seeking understanding. So his idea that faith and reason are not enemies of one another, are not antagonistic to each other, but that knowledge and understanding is actually a part of the Christian faith and a part of the Christian vocation, that we can love God, we can pursue God by learning about Him and learning about His world. So that's how we're going to come at it today. Tomorrow is actually the feast day of St. Anselm in the Western Church, and so we thought this was an especially fitting time for us to explore a bit of the thought of Anselm. He's not that well known of a figure, and so we thought that many in our community would be interested in learning more about him, particularly his contributions to this question of knowing and believing. And we are delighted to be joined today by someone who spent a lot of time with Anselm and his work. Gavin Ortlund is the senior pastor at First Baptist Church in Ojai, California. Gavin has a PhD in historical theology from Fuller Seminary, as well as an MDiv from Covenant Seminary in St. Louis. And he is the author of several books: Theological Retrieval for Evangelicals, a new book that's coming out this year, Recovering Augustine's Doctrine of Creation, and a second book that's coming out this year, and the one that's most relevant for our topic today, which is a new commentary on Anselm's Proslogion, and it's called, the book is called Anselm's Pursuit of Joy, and that's forthcoming with Catholic University of America Press. So Gavin, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure. Great to be with you guys.
Where are you joining us from remotely, Gavin?
I live in Ojai, so this is my church office here.
Fabulous. Well, before we jump into the conversation, I just want to remind participants that we're going to have plenty of time for questions as part of this exchange. So at any point, you can post those questions in the Q&A using the Q&A feature. I think it's at the bottom of your menu there in Zoom. And so feel free, as the conversation's happening, just to populate some of those questions. And in the second half of this hour, we're going to have plenty of time to come at those questions. So Gavin, I'm wondering if you could give our participants a bit of a brief introduction to St. Anselm. As I said, he's not that well known of a figure among Christians, and so some kind of historical context would be helpful for us, but I'm wondering if you could do that a little bit autobiographically. So if you could tell us a little bit about your story with Anselm. How did you first encounter him? How did you get interested in his work? And then what sort of kept you with Anselm for as long as you've been working and thinking on him?
Yeah, well, so Anselm lived from 1033 to 1109. He was sort of a medieval monk, and he was born in northern Italy He lived in a little town called Bec, and he was a monk for many years in northern France, and then eventually he became the Archbishop of Canterbury in England. And he's probably famous for two things. One is his work on the atonement. What is the doctrine of the atonement? How do we understand Christ's atoning work upon the cross? And secondly, an argument for God's existence called the Ontological Argument. And that was my point of entry for Anselm. I think I was a senior in high school, maybe, and my brother gave me just a short little article, not of Anselm, but just kind of summarizing what this argument is. And it was just fascinating to, I think it was probably the first time in my life that I discovered how interesting ideas can be and how much fun it can be to pursue ideas. And because it was just so mind-boggling to think, can you really prove that God exists from the mere idea of God, which is what the ontological argument is. It says if you can actually think of God, automatically that itself will entail that he must exist if you thought of him rightly. And I thought, well, surely you can't do that. And yet, in the technical presentation of the argument, I couldn't see what was wrong with it. And so that just drew me in. And then that point of entry opened me up to other things in Anselm. And I began to think, here I am, a Protestant evangelical Christian in the United States, preparing to be a pastor. And yet there's this medieval monk, and there's just ways that he's different that are so interesting and kind of pull me in. And I just became convinced there's a lot that we can learn from Anselm in the modern age. There's a lot of benefit to be had. It's kind of like in the scene, Mr. Holland's Opus, where he's describing how he loves jazz music, and he says he got a CD of Miles Coltrane, and at first he couldn't stand it, so he kept listening to it to try to understand it. And he said, eventually I couldn't stop listening to it. And then he says, eventually I knew what I wanted to do with my life. And just the differences, the oddities in Anselm kind of drew me in. And I've just become convinced there's a lot of benefit to be had from studying him, dialoguing with him, and thinking how his ideas might intersect with our culture today specifically.
And Gavin, we're going to talk a lot about Anselm's ideas about knowing and believing, and sort of that faith and knowledge contribution that he's made. But what, just briefly, what are some of the other areas that you find him sort of most helpful for contemporary Christians to engage with?
I think for Christians, and especially for me as a pastor, one of the ways would just be Anselm's doctrine of God and how much he emphasized God's transcendence and God's otherness and sort of the height of God, so to speak. His great problem that he's tackling in the atonement is how can a good God forgive? How can a God not who is just and good not condemn everyone? And I've always found that so interesting because in our context, we have in some ways the opposite question, in Tim Keller's book, The Reason for God, he gives 8 of the biggest objections in our culture. And even though the book is 12 years old now, I think this objection is still pretty alive, though maybe less so actually now than 12 years ago. But that's how could God ever judge? How could a loving God ever send someone to hell or judge, even a historical judgment? And it's just interesting that Anselm had the opposite question that we have. He didn't just have a different answer. He had a totally different question, a totally different framework. And I don't think that means that we automatically have to assume that we're wrong and Anselm was right. But I do think it can induce humility to some of the cultural presuppositions we have to step into the shoes of someone like Anselm, this medieval monk, and try to understand the world through his perspective and ask, how did this make sense to him? And the sort of priority of God and his thinking would be one example of where I think there's a lot of benefit to be had from considering his view of things.
And just to situate him a little bit historically, so you mentioned he's writing in the 11th century, the beginning of the 12th century. This is right before kind of medieval universities get established, correct?
That's right. Yeah, the monasteries eventually sort of morphed into something that would become the universities. So the monasteries were very intellectual places,
Mhm.
but they weren't technically yet.
So it's maybe fair to say that he's really important for our conversation as an institution that's focused on the university, serving the university in terms of someone whose thought was influential for the kind of development of the university. Is that a fair articulation?
I think so. I've always found it kind of fascinating that the modern caricature of the medieval time is that it's this kind of backwards and dark time. And since the Enlightenment, people have called it the Dark Ages, a time of ignorance and superstition. And yet, the university is a medieval invention.
Mm,
And Anselm would certainly be one figure that was very influential. Anselm is sometimes called the father of scholasticism.
mm.
Um, he was sort of early on in the development of medieval theology that placed more emphasis upon logical rigor, deep analysis. So certainly all of that was very influential, I think.
Hmm. And so turning to the topic of the exchange, knowing and believing, and you mentioned that Anselm can be really helpful for us because he's so far sort of out of our experience and coming at questions in a way that's different from us today, in a way that we can learn from. Um, Perhaps you can start helping us unpack that a little bit. In what ways is Anselm thinking about reason and thinking about knowledge and this sort of question of knowing and believing in ways that are especially different from the ways that we think about those kind of key terms of faith and reason today?
Yeah, okay. Well, as you mentioned, he's famous for the slogan, faith seeking understanding. And that really does encapsulate his approach to questions of faith and knowledge and belief. Um, I would say there's a couple of ways that modern views could be an alternative to that. One would be reason instead of faith. I mean, this would be a very common modern outlook. That would be a more secular view of the world that we've sort of, I mean, I've just been reading the book Enlightenment Now by Steven
Mhm.
Pinker. This book really embodies this mindset. We've outgrown religion and faith, and now reason really needs to guide all aspects of human life and human civilization and so forth. And certainly Anselm would be different from that.
Mhm.
Another modern alternative, though, would be in the opposite direction, faith instead of reason. And this is actually a pretty common approach among prominent Christians and at the popular level, I think, in certain ways.
Mm,
Not everyone might put it like that, but there's a lot of very prominent Christians who do want to move away from rational argumentation in some way or another for the preservation of faith. Sometimes people like Kierkegaard are read in these terms. Sometimes people like Karl Barth, even though sometimes I think it's not quite fair how they are put in that category. But you have a lot of people. I mean, I've heard Barth's theology summarized once as the attempt to save Christianity by making it irrational.
mm,
And I actually don't think that's necessarily the fairest summary of Barth, but that is an instinct that is in the world. There are people who want to run away, and even at the popular level, you can see. In fact, I think it's actually true pervasively throughout our culture that we rely on technical, logical argumentation for our belief systems less
mm.
than in previous times. And I've done some just reading about the sociology of this and the way the internet and social media and cable news and other things don't necessarily make us the most critical thinkers. But there's a third alternative to Anselm that might just be faith plus reason, that
Mm.
you need to combine these two things together. They're either 50-50 or they're 60-40 or they're 95-5,
Mhm.
but they combine together to get, and Anselm is very different from that because he says, you start with faith and you pursue understanding, but the understanding that reason can achieve is to nourish you in your faith. It's to produce joy in your faith. It can, at times, in a limited way, play a sort of apologetics role. It can give a commendation of your faith to someone else in certain ways, but it's very limited. It doesn't complete your faith. It's not as though you think you believe 80% from faith and then 20% of argument really convinces you.
Mm-hmm.
He says, you know, and the metaphor I've used for this is a marriage relationship where you know that you love your spouse based upon your relationship and your experience of this person. You could give a rational defense of the integrity of your relationship. You could go to court and say, here's how much we spend on our anniversary gifts each year. The neighbors can give a good report. You know, you can give evidences, but those things don't convince you that you love your wife. You know you love your spouse, and those things may play a supplementary role, but the knowledge is not yielded from the arguments. And Anselm is very much like that. He has a huge doctrine of experience. He thinks that on the basis of your experience of God, received in terms of faith, that will yield certainty. And reason comes in a subsidiary way at that point to play an important role, but a limited role. And I think that's very different from how many people think of faith and reason today.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if we could, just to kind of elucidate that further, define some of these key terms for Anselm. So, you know, we've said faith, we've said reason, and I use the term knowing, and we talked about sort of knowing and believing. And what you were just saying was that it sounded like for Anselm, perhaps knowing isn't just sort of a faculty of reason. So I'd be curious to hear, how might you kind of offer a definition from Anselm for what faith is? I think faith and reason maybe are the most important terms to define. And if there's ways to highlight about sort of how he might be using those differently than I think you've already got at that somewhat, but.
Okay, yeah, I think maybe the two most important distinctions to make would be with regard to reason. Anselm doesn't mean that in a strictly kind of Cartesian sense of individual reason stripped of all other presuppositions. He thinks of reason as a spiritual faculty. He thinks that because we're created in God's image, and he ties that, like most Christians have with that throughout church history, with our rationality. He thinks rational meditation is a spiritual activity consonant with prayer that uniquely yields a kind of knowledge of God. In other words, we can approach God in a unique way. We can see farther into the divine essence through reason than through other avenues. And that's very interesting. That's a very different view of reason than most of us would have in our day. And then in terms of faith, I think Anselm by faith has in mind, sometimes the distinction is made between fides qua, which is the faith by which we believe, that's subjective faith, trust in our heart, and fides quae, the faith that is believed, and that's the content of Christianity. And he means fides qua, he means a heart of trusting assent to the Lord. So it's a very existential thing. So I think that's what he means by faith. He means a heart of trusting assent to the Lord.
And so is it fair to say for him that faith is bound up with reason, or sort of is an entry point into reason, rather than these two things being sort of different domains? That there's sort of a domain of faith that deals with matters of revelation, and then there's a domain of reason that deals with sort of the natural world or something like that. He's rejecting that kind of dichotomy, right?
Yes, in fact, I think such a dichotomy would have even been unintelligible to him. And I think it's a product of the modern era that we think of faith and reason as alternatives. I think Anselm would have thought of faith as a tool, or excuse me, he would have thought of reason as a tool to be employed by faith.
Okay.
This is one tool that faith can utilize. And that's why, you know, some people often say, and it's amazingly common throughout the literature on Anselm, to say that he contradicts himself, because on the one hand, he's got these statements that make it sound like it's all about faith, you know, faith-seeking understanding. And there's lots of passages where he basically says, you know, it's 100% faith that results in knowledge. But then there's other passages where he says, in particular books, he describes their method as by reason alone. I'm going to argue by reason alone. And so people think he's contradicting himself, as though he's both a fideist and a rationalist at the same time. And I think actually that's because of the modern contrast for faith and reason. Anselm wouldn't have recognized a tension between these two things And I think when he said by reason alone, he was actually excluding authority.
Mm.
Religious texts, St. Augustine, Florilegia, which are compilations of quotes from sacred texts that were frequently used in medieval argumentation. And the common way of arguing in the early medieval time is you just see who can get more quotes,
Mm.
who can quote Augustine more, and who has more Bible verses, and who can quote Bede and Gregory Moore and other people like that. That was very common in the early medieval era. Anselm's saying, I'm going to argue by reason alone. And what he means by that is, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to utilize arguments rather than just an appeal to authority. But that's a statement of method. It's not an alternative epistemology or statement of how we know things. So it's really not in contrast with faith as we've defined it, a heart of trusting assent to the Lord. You can use arguments while your heart is assenting to the Lord. You don't, it's simply a matter of the method of not utilizing sacred texts as
Mm.
your authority.
And so thinking about sort of reason as method, for somebody that's already believing, as you're saying, that Anselm was trying to reason, what do you see as kind of the value for him in taking that approach, as opposed to just relying on authorities? Why was he trying to employ this method of using reason without an appeal to authority to better understand God?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it wasn't that he felt that we needed more certainty or something like that, as though merely relying upon religious authorities is too authoritarian and blind or something like that. He doesn't take that view. There's many passages in which he'll say, hey, you don't need my arguments. Just believe it on the basis of Scripture. Every Christian should receive what is taught in Holy Scripture. So it's not that he feels there's something necessarily lacking necessarily, but I think he does think that reason can help play a role of kind of clarifying and elucidating the fittingness of our beliefs as followers of Jesus, such that when we've thought them through rationally, it can produce a kind of nourishment and a kind of joy. You know, in the way that you're not more certain that it's true, but you understand it more thoroughly. And so there's a joy in that process. I think that's how he would have thought of it, actually. Again, very different from how we think of these things today.
Do you see, so kind of turning to contemporary circumstances, do you see any ways in which Anselm is maybe anticipating sort of some moves in our present, or do you see any particular resonance of things that people are arguing today? I mean, you mentioned already Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now as sort of a very alternative way of thinking about reason to what Anselm is offering. Do you see kind of any moves in the present or any contemporary figures that are kind of more in harmony with the way that Anselm is approaching these questions? And I'm thinking both kind of people within the academy, but also kind of broader cultural, or any kind of return to Anselm, if you will, in the 21st century that you've seen?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about this. I think there are some superficial similarities between Anselm and sort of postmodern criticisms of rationalism. I mean, there's lots of people in our culture who are very cynical about rational systems, and they might like the things that Anselm says about experience and about kind of, I mean, there's things in Anselm that are very sort of mystical, and I can see that that kind of can fit with the modern ethos in some ways. But I think beneath the superficial similarities, there's also a lot of differences between the way postmodern philosophy criticizes rationalism and the way Anselm criticizes rationalism. Because postmodern philosophy often ends sort of in despair and in cynicism, and you don't really have anything firm that you're grounded upon. Whereas Anselm, when he criticizes rationalism, he does so when it is stripped away from faith. But at no point does Anselm himself move away from the necessity of faith. And I've often thought of, I actually think Anselm can, in some respects, be a way out for those of us like myself who are sort of burnt out on the postmodern or the late modern, if you prefer, Western outlook. I mean, I'm a millennial. I'm thoroughly sort of postmodern in my own instincts, and I've agonized my way through the kinds of questions that come up in our particular cultural context of, how do we find certainty amidst the myriad of options of different beliefs that are on the table? And whatever rational investigation we do, it will always yield something short of a certainty. And yet I need a certainty on the basis of which to live my life. It's kind of the classic existentialist dilemma. And I find Anselm so helpful as a way out. He's got a different whole orientation to the question. I'll put it like this. It's almost like he calls for a childlike faith. And he points to these are big words, but I'll just define them: the fiduciary character of all knowledge. Fiduciary meaning faith-like. It's the adjective of the noun faith. So all knowledge involves trust. All knowledge. Trust of something. We're not robots. And I think Anselm can remind us that actually the way human beings are designed to arrive at truth and to know is kind of like the way a child relates to mom or dad. There's trust and there's love involved. And that's actually, I believe, a way out of the despair of postmodern times, at least at a deeply personal level. That's how I've experienced Anselm. He's kind of like, oh yeah, we don't have to go the way the modern West has gone. There's dead ends there. There's a way out of those dead ends. And reading the old thinkers like Anselm can be a reminder of just other ways to approach these deep questions.
I'm struck a bit by, it seems like there are some, I don't know if you'd want to call them postmodern, but there's some contemporary Christian thinkers who are stressing, as you said, this emphasis on trust kind of at the base of all knowledge. And I'm sure non-Christian thinkers as well, but I'm thinking a little bit of Michael Polanyi, the philosopher of science, who's arguing that sort of all knowledge is deeply personal. I've read some other kind of philosophy of science that emphasizes the role of authority and tradition kind of within scientific knowing. And then I think, of course, of Alistair McIntyre, the Christian philosopher, who's emphasizing the sort of traditionness of all rationality and reason. So it does seem like there are thinkers that are maybe postmodern or getting to sort of a recovery of something that we lost. I think as you highlighted with Anselm, I sometimes hear Anselm and Augustine talked about together. Is Augustine sort of a similar source for that kind of different way of thinking about the relationship between trust and knowledge, or trust and reason?
I think, yes, I think Augustine and Anselm are very similar in their approach to these things. I think, in fact, some of the statements that are most explicit about faith-seeking understanding can also be found in Augustine. And I do think that's sort of a classical Christian instinct of a way to approach these two things. Anselm's a little different from Augustine in some respects, in that there's a later Christian philosopher and thinker and theologian named Boethius. And at the library in Beck, it was all about Augustine and Boethius. So those were the two great influences on Anselm's thinking. And Boethius had such an emphasis upon dialectical logic and argumentation. So Anselm does have more technical arguments in some respects because of that Boethian influence. But in the primary question of faith and reason, I think Anselm and Augustine are very much in a similar place.
I'm curious about sort of the question of belief. So, we've talked about faith-seeking understanding as sort of a believing reason. I'm curious about a sort of unbelieving reason. So somebody that doesn't put their trust in God in the same way, and how that affects rationality. And I guess I'm especially interested for us as 21st Christians in a pluralistic culture where we're interacting with people that think very differently about some of these, primary kind of metaphysical or theological questions. Anselm House being positioned at a secular university. How does Anselm approach people who may disagree on some of these questions of God? Does that come up in his work, and how might he answer the question of kind of comprehension and conversation across different traditions or different modes of believing?
I see Anselm as someone who might help us steer between an overconfidence on rational argumentation and a complete avoidance of rational argumentation, so that when we're dialoguing across ideologies or faiths or something like that, Anselm would be a one certainly not to say simply don't argue. He thinks arguments, and he is read in that way sometimes. There's a quote by Barth, and because Anselm was very significant for Barth, and Barth has a quote where he says basically the dialogue between believers and unbelievers is like that between the bats and owls at night and the birds that fly at day, and they're trying to talk about the sun, and only one of these creatures has ever seen the sun, and so it's just sort of hopeless dialogue. And I don't actually think that's a fair reading of Anselm, though he really emphasizes the necessity of faith. He does think, to go back to the marriage metaphor, a case can be made that might be useful. It won't yield a experiential knowledge like is necessary, but it can still commend the faith. So I think Anselm helps us towards a more balanced posture where we will try to give reasons for our faith. We will try to explain why we believe what we believe, but we will recognize that the arguments themselves will not be, of the power to convince just by their strength of argument. And that accords with my great interest. My research interests right now are in the realm of apologetics, and I'm really interested in apologetics that appeals to beauty and provides a kind of more probable framework for the experience that we have in our world, and provides a better explanatory context for the world. It's a little different approach than just trying to hammer people with deductive arguments. And I think Anselm's overall posture is probably resonant with that more cautious approach.
I want to, let's see, it's 12:35. I want to turn to some questions, but they actually fit really well with what we've just been talking about. So the first one is really on the question of certainty and uncertainty in faith and in the Christian's journey. And I'm curious, is that even really a question for Anselm, this idea of certainty versus kind of probability or lack of certainty, and how would he see the role of certainty or uncertainty in faith and in the Christian's pursuit of knowledge?
Well, I think insofar as a believer is genuinely exercising faith, I do think there's a kind of certainty that Anselm thinks will result from that. This is very tough, and pastorally I wrestle with this a great deal because, of course, all thoughtful Christians have moments of struggle to understand what they believe, and some of us, myself certainly, have had seasons of great travail and angst working through, a doubt or an objection, and seasons where you're working through those things. And that's a common testimony of Christians to experience that. So I don't think Anselm would be at odds with that, because he himself agonizes through his own struggles in his prayers and meditations, for example, and even in the Proslogion. There's so many passages where he's saying, Lord, I long to see your truth, but I'm enshrouded in the darkness, So I think that honest experience that we don't have a certainty in every sense all the time if we have faith. I think Anselm would recognize that. I've often thought of this in terms of the way Blaise Pascal, the later philosopher, put it, and it's really helped me. In fact, I just reread through Pascal's Pensées, which are his thoughts, this last year, and I just it was deeply helpful to me personally. What Pascal says is, look, if God gave you 100% rational certainty, would that be what you need? He says, of course not. The kind of world we live in and the kind of relationship God wants to have with us is not best served by 100% rational certainty. And he says, God's put you in a situation where we have enough certainty to function on the basis of, but also the right amount of uncertainty and travail that will produce love, and that is most conducive to producing love in our relationship with God. And that at least gives an explanation for the existential dilemma of, here I am, I'm thrown into this world. Anything I do, no matter how hard I study, I'll never be 100% sure of what the truth is. What do I do? And Pascal is saying that there's a love and faith that can be issued forth in that very situation that is the answer to that problem. And I actually think Anselm, in his spirit and his instincts and his way of functioning, would be very consistent with that. So the pastoral burden I have for people is to, when they're in a time of crisis or doubt or uncertainty, to not necessarily feel that that reflects badly on their faith. That might be an honest indication of a real faith.
I'm curious about the idea of sort of a leap of faith, kind of coming out of that question. Kierkegaard is famous for this idea of needing to take a leap of faith for the Christian, a kind of existential commitment despite that lack of certainty. Pascal, as you highlighted, really focuses on kind of the limits of reason, the need to sort of go beyond what reason can give us. Do you see Anselm as suggesting a kind of leap of faith in any way? Or, I mean, how would you, channeling Anselm, think about that relationship between kind of reason and what faith requires?
Well, at the popular level, the idea of a leap of faith sometimes is used to express a kind of irrational impulse. In other words, you take a leap because, the whole idea, it's a leap because it's not based on anything rational. That's why it's a leap. And in that sense, I don't think Anselm, or for that matter, Kierkegaard, would be completely sympathetic with that, at least with how that's cashed out in many people's thoughts. I do think that Anselm, if by a leap, if what is meant is that one's rational pursuit of truth gets you to this point, and that point is short of certainty. It's short of what I actually need to function in this world. I need to make a decision. I mean, this is the idea of Pascal's wager. It's like the die is cast. You got to do something. And so my rational investigation of, say someone's wrestling with Christianity and they have genuine doubts, and they're like, well, I've read the William Lane Craig books about the cosmological argument. I've read Richard Swinburne on the design argument. I read Gary Habermas on the resurrection argument, but I'm like 70% sure that it's probably true. And that changes day by day. On Monday, I'm 70. On Tuesday, I'm 60. It's like up and that's a common experience. And a leap of faith could be a reasonable way to think if what is meant by that is not an irrational plunge into the dark, but rather an existential commitment at a deep interior level of our heart that is reasonable, but it's not strictly required or even encouraged by the arguments. So you go from that 60 or 70% certainty to I'm all in. And then there's the experiential dynamic that takes over at that point. I think Anselm actually would be consistent with that kind of thinking because of his very high view of experience.
And I've heard some people say that sort of that experience of uncertainty is actually a sort of necessary part of faith, because if you lacked that, if you had 100% certainty around it, it wouldn't actually be faith, because it doesn't require that sort of trust that goes beyond what you're able to kind of grasp by reason. So the experience of doubt or uncertainty is in some sense sort of necessarily tied to faith. Is that also, you think, kind of consistent with Anselm's thought around faith?
I think that it is, broadly so. The metaphor of falling in love and making a decision to get married is a great one. It's not an irrational decision to say, I love her, I'm going to propose, even though you don't have any kind of rational arguments. It's an existential thing. And I think relating to God by faith is more like falling in love than like doing a math problem or something like that, where you don't act until you've got the figures right. There is an existential dynamic to it. And so, yeah, I mean, no relationship really works where you have total certainty. That's just not authentic to even human relationships. And so it's reasonable to think that there would be comparable dynamics in our relationship with God. I think we need to be careful with that. We don't want to push that in such a way that leads to an irrationalism, as though we're just deciding something arbitrarily.
Mm-hmm.
So the one way to nuance it is to say it's not contrary to reasons, it's just not reducible to reasons.
Mm-hmm.
There's a remainder that isn't required by the rational evidence.
So we've got another question here, a little bit about the historical context, but I think it flows right into this question of the relationship between reason and rationality. And it's sort of, how do we think about Anselm in relation to Thomas Aquinas, who came just after Anselm, kind of at the time that the medieval university is getting going, the kind of the rediscovery of Aristotle. Obviously, he's thinking in some ways that are very different from at least what Anselm had available. But I'm curious, especially on this question of faith and reason and knowing and believing. Do you see primarily similarities between Anselm and Aquinas, or do you see some differences there? How do you, and if you can keep this sort of in very layperson's terms?
Well, the broad picture, I think, is that Thomas has a higher view of reason.
Mm.
I think Thomas can be caricatured sometimes too, as though he's a strict rationalist. And Thomas had this great experience at the end of his life where he says, in light of this experience I've had, everything I wrote, I disown, So he's got a very high view of experience as well. And sometimes the rationalistic impulse of Thomas is more a method than an epistemology, just like with Anselm. But Thomas does have some things where he'll say, here's what you know by reason and here's what you know by faith, like that. And that's not something Anselm says. So I think Thomas does differ from Anselm a little bit, and having a little higher view of the role of reason.
Here's a question about, what do you think Anselm would say about Darwin's theory of evolution? And I'm trying to think, kind of tying this back to the question of faith and knowledge, knowing and believing. What would be your response to that?
Okay. Well, of course, there's a challenge with questions like this, in that Anselm had no reason to doubt what we call the fixity of species. He lived in a historical context where he certainly believed that animal species did not, that were relatively stable in how we should taxonomize them. I think, were Anselm alive today, his approach to this type of question, I think he would, the faith-seeking understanding approach, I think, would be open-minded to consider, because there's the seeking understanding part. He's going to be asking questions of, how should we understand this claim? And if he's certain that it is at odds with faith, then that's a problem. But there's many times where something that we believe, we can believe for poor reasons, or we can misunderstand something, or the classic example in the history of science would be heliocentrism, and how many people opposed that because they read in Psalm chapter 93, verse 1, it says, the earth shall not be moved. And they said, see, it must be geocentrism. But they were misinterpreting that verse. And slowly people began to realize that as the science kept coming in. I think Anselm would be one who would argue for very careful sifting of the evidence. And he would, and that would include a careful analysis of, what does faith require? What are the points theologically that are immovable here, that are taught in Holy Scripture, and so forth? I've done a lot of thinking about this, less with Anselm and more with Augustine. And you mentioned the book coming out in July called Retrieving Augustine's Doctrine of Creation. And in that book, I argue that Augustine's way of thinking about it would be with certain caveats, probably open to evolutionary science, but with certain caveats.
There's a question here on Anselm's devotional works. And this was maybe a question that I had as I was looking at some of Anselm's writings in advance of this, but he weaves prayers and meditations kind of into his philosophical works as well, which is something that you don't see, any contemporary philosophers doing. You don't see most theologians even kind of doing devotional work kind of in the same context as they're doing the theological work. So I'm curious if you could reflect on the relationship between those two for him. Why is it that you see some of these devotional meditations like right at the beginning of the Proslogion and some other places?
Yes, and this is one of the great mysteries of the Proslogion for many people. The whole thing is a prayer patterned after Augustine's Confessions, and yet in the context of a prayer, all 26 chapters addressed to God, he offers an argument for God's existence. So you find sentences in chapters 2 through 4 that say roughly, "So now, Lord, I know that you exist," which is kind of funny because he's talking to God, but he's saying he's proving his existence. And I think this just goes back to some of our earlier comments about how for Anselm, spirituality and rationality were all of one thread. He wouldn't have even perceived it to be unusual to pray and offer technical reasoning in the same paragraph, because in his context, there was no reason to see those things at odds with one another. And I think for people who are watching this and want to engage Anselm a little bit more, one great place to start would be his prayers and meditations. You can really get a sense of who he is and what drives him by reading those.
And any particular works or passages that you would point folks to within his prayers and meditations, or is there a volume that collects them?
Benedicta Ward has a great introduction to a collection of the prayers and meditations. I think diving in anywhere would be interesting. Protestant Christians will really struggle with them because they're addressed to Mary and Peter and all the other saints. And so it brings up the question of praying to the saints. It's a great example of where I think we should engage with humble and yet critical dialogue to try to understand. This is one of the many points where we could caricature the medievals. And yet, I personally don't believe in praying to the saints. So I'm not saying we should just absorb everything we get from Anselm, but it's good to understand. And his meditations are very intense. So, he's constantly bewailing his sins, and the whole point of them is to stir up compunction, which means sorrow for sin. So you really get a flavor of his spirituality and sort of the intensity of it by reading those. And I think that's a good experience, but I don't take them as sort of gospel truth in every passage.
Gavin, you mentioned some of your current interests in thinking about sort of apologetics in a vein that goes beyond just sort of rational argumentation, and the role of beauty in apologetics and sort of convincing someone. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about that, and maybe, I don't know if you would say that the experience of beauty is sort of an experiential mode of knowing that goes beyond or is different from kind of rationality. And I think you alluded that might be sort of that focus on sort of modes of experience that go beyond reason might be in line with how Anselm is thinking about rationality. So I'd love to hear you reflect more on that kind of question of the role of experience and particularly beauty in apologetics.
Yes, well, I think Anselm would have been very comfortable with Jonathan Edwards' metaphor that used in a sermon once of, it's one thing to taste honey and know that it's sweet from tasting it. It's another thing to just know theoretically that honey is sweet. There's that experiential. And I think beauty would be one way in which we experience in such a way that leads to knowledge. I've just been thinking a lot about this lately because in my current writing project, I'm thinking about an argument for music for God. And the argument basically, one of the pieces of the argument is just to observe a series of anecdotes of how many people actually have come to believe in God from music, or have said, they listen to music and they say, wow, maybe there is a God. Or, Einstein had a famous time, for example, he listened to a young violin prodigy play, and afterwards he said, now I know that there's a God. And I think he was probably speaking metaphorically, but still. And Steve Jobs said the same thing. Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs has an anecdote where Yo-Yo Ma, the cello player, played for Steve Jobs, and then Steve Jobs, after he heard it, said, "That's the best argument I've ever heard for the existence of God." Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because the way I cash it out is basically music conveys a sense of transcendence and deep meaning. When we listen to beautiful music, it conveys a deep sense of meaning at a visceral level. And the question then is, well, what's the best way to explain that? And so I make what's called an abductive argument, which is just an argument that's for an argument to the best explanation. I'm just saying, I think some kind of theism is probably a better way to account for that than a naturalistic worldview, because naturalism doesn't have many explanations for that transcendence. Basically, it relies upon evolutionary explanations, that there's things about what helped us survive in the past, pattern recognition and so forth, that make music enjoyable to us, and those are very unsatisfying. They're not authentic to the actual experience of beauty in music. And so I think, music is just one example of other areas where I think beauty can make a very powerful appeal. It really works in real life. A lot of us, I've had these moments where the beauty of music really conveys a deep sense of ultimate meaning and transcendence. And I think that's a perfectly valid means by which to arrive upon knowledge, at least to some degree.
Well, I'm mindful of the time here, and I maybe want to end with asking, you mentioned Anselm's devotional works and meditations as one place that people might go, but where are some other places in Anselm's work that you would direct participants to head if they're interested in pursuing these questions more directly with Anselm? And I'm thinking particularly this question of faith and reason, or knowing and believing. Are there kind of places in the works of Anselm that you would point them to as starting points?
Okay. Well, I love to direct people to Anselm himself. I think he's easier to read. He's more enjoyable to read than any of the secondary literature on Anselm. There's a great collection of Anselm's writings that's published by Hackett, Hackett. It's a publisher, I think, in Indianapolis, and I think it's just called Anselm Selected Writings. And within that book, the Monologion and Proslogion are two of Anselm's earlier writings that I think would be very useful for people, especially the Proslogion. That's his most famous work. It has his argument for God's existence, but there's so much else in there. That's where the chapter 1 of that book is where the phrase faith-seeking understanding primarily comes from. And I see it's coming up in the comments. People can check it out. Yeah, and then also within that book, there's a letter called On the Incarnation of the Word, which was written about a particular heresy about the Trinity at the time. It's very brief, but the first few pages unpack his views of faith and reason very well. In 4 or 5 pages, you can get a real great account of Anselm's view of faith and reason. So I'd really recommend that as well.
Okay. Well, thanks, Gavin. And I'd be amiss if I didn't remind people that Gavin's book on the Proslogion is coming out later this year, correct?
That's right. It's actually, I'm waiting any day to hope it comes in the mail. The publication date is May 1st.
Okay, May 1st.
So any day now, I hope I'll see it.
So as he said, dive right into Anselm, but you may want to check out Gavin's book as a helpful commentary, a helpful guide alongside reading the Proslogion. Well, Gavin, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise, for engaging us in conversation here at Anselm House.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun.
It's a delight. And I want to invite the rest of you to join us for another Anselm Exchange tomorrow. We are going to be celebrating the culmination of this series on the renewal of all things, and celebrating the feast day of St Anselm with a conversation on Christian renewal and the public university. So we're going to be thinking about the vocation of Christians within the public university. How do Christians be present in the university and work for the flourishing of everyone in that context? So our executive director, Brian Bateman, is going to be in conversation with Robert Louis Wilkin, who is a distinguished historian of Christianity who spent much of his career teaching at the University of Virginia. And so that's going to be at 6:30 p.m. Central Standard Time tomorrow. You can find more. I think we can put it in the comments here as well, a link to more information on our website where you can sign up and join us tomorrow for that. So thank you for joining us today for this conversation, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.